We're kicking it off tonight with that will he or won't he act that has the whole world on edge from Vladimir Putin and the new warning shot from President Biden. Do not invade Ukraine or else. We now know more about that or else and what it actually is in a conversation between both presidents being called direct and useful. But will Putin listen? Will he stand down? We're live at the White House and live in Russia in a minute. Plus, we've got that pretty heated back and forth between prosecutors and Jussie Smollett, who's insisting under oath he did not stage that anti-gay racist attack on himself. That and a preview of closing arguments coming up, plus an update on an international murder mystery. A man accused of being part of the group who killed journalist Jamal Khashoggi. His fiancée saying today she wants this new suspect tried for that crime. And you know the pandemic's been hard on everybody, physically, mentally, but we're learning tonight just how hard it's been on kids in particular. We'll talk about that later in the show. And speaking of mental health, Instagram's been taking heat for how it affects teen girls. Now, the app's putting in place new safety rules right before their CEO shows up in front of Congress tomorrow. More on what you need to know in a bit. Hey, I'm Hallie, and we're starting with that pretty huge homework assignment for President Biden to try and talk Vladimir Putin back from the brink of war with Ukraine. And right now, that threat seems very real. Check it out. You're about to be looking at the only video that we have of this conversation today between the president and Putin face to face. This video is courtesy of the Kremlin, we should note. The leaders talked for a couple of hours about a bunch of stuff, but mostly Ukraine. And in those talks, the White House says President Biden was direct and straightforward. He backs Ukraine's independence. He wants Putin to de-escalate, to back off. And if Putin doesn't, if he actually invades, the president's warning, get ready for consequences. Now, is an invasion something Putin actually plans to do? Hard to say. Today, the president's national security advisor says the U.S. still doesn't think the Russian leader has made a decision. But just in case, Ukraine is getting ready. You're looking at the country's military running drills. Just in the last few hours, there were reports of machine gun fighting, of grenade attacks on the border. A top diplomat there says they fear a, quote, bloody massacre. And take a look at this map. This is where the Ukrainian government says Russia's military is starting to build up its forces. They say there's more than 90,000 Russian troops waiting on the border. We're probably not going to see any diplomatic breakthroughs today, probably not tomorrow, probably not even in the next week or two. Moscow seems very willing to take this slow. But here's one thing we do know. World leaders are very concerned about what might come next. And the president, he's staying in close touch with them to stay on the same page. I want to bring in Mike Memoli, who's over at the White House. So, Mike, we know that President Biden has been delivering this message to President Putin. This was extremely direct. This was extremely straightforward, right? And there's this question of what the, as we said at the top of the show, what the or else actually is, what those consequences actually are, right? We're getting some clarity on that, even just in the last couple hours. Tell us about it.
So the way the White House is putting it is that the president gave President Putin two options here. There's a very complicated, potentially lengthy diplomatic process to try to work through some of the very real issues that both sides have as it relates to Ukraine and potentially its future as a member of NATO. And then there's the or else of both increased military involvement, not necessarily the U.S. troops on the ground there, but potentially additional military support, defensive support to Ukraine itself, more coordination with some of our NATO allies who are neighbors to the north of Ukraine, and very serious economic sanctions. Now, there has been talk of economic sanctions in the past, we know, but this is a president who has been very closely engaged in this issue of Ukraine for much of his career. And he knows some of the options that were considered in 2014, for instance, when Russia annexed Ukraine, but not necessarily used by the Obama administration. And so those are some of the options that now President Biden is keeping open.
Mike, you know, we heard from the national security advisor this idea that President Biden said very clearly to Vladimir Putin, hey, the things that we did not do back in 2014, back when Russia invaded Crimea and set off that whole mess, we are ready to do now, right?
That's exactly right. And it's interesting because this is a president with a long history in Ukraine. There is no foreign policy challenge that occupied Vice President Biden's time more in his second term than this issue of Ukraine. I was looking back through some of my notes when I was covering him at the time. He visited and delivered remarks to the Ukrainian parliament in 2015, just in fact a few weeks after he announced he wasn't running for president a couple weeks before. One of his last stops, in fact, in his final 3 days as vice president, he went to Ukraine yet again to reaffirm his support for that country. And now I don't need to remind you, it was the issue of Ukraine. It was President Trump's attempt to leverage Ukraine's government to try to investigate Biden's son that led to his impeachment. So this is something that is very close and personal to Biden, but there's also a larger issue of American credibility here that Biden's wrestling with. He's hosting a summit of democracies later this week. There has been a lot of attention. Biden has talked endlessly about this framing of autocracies versus democracies to run the rules of the road for the 21st century. And so more than anything, it's in some ways American credibility at stake that President Biden is dealing with here. And a lot of questions here in Washington about whether he will follow through on some of the very harsh words that were exchanged between these two today.
You talk about this American credibility in some ways on the line here. You have seen President Biden be so careful to bring in our allies on this, right? Bookending this conversation before it happened, after it happened, talking with our allies in Europe and NATO.
And that's important because some of the leverage that the United States believes it has here is only as strong as our allies being willing to go along with it, especially as it relates to something that was raised at the briefing today. Nord Stream 2, we've heard a lot about. It's a pipeline in which Germany would be getting more oil directly from Russia. That's something that we need Germany to ensure that they will use that as leverage themselves. And Hallie, I want to talk about somebody who's having a heck of a final day in office, and that's Angela Merkel. Right. She came into office 16 years ago. Russia and the relationship to the West has been a real dominant sort of recurring issue of her tenure. Today is her last day as the German chancellor, and she spent part of it on the phone with President Biden dealing with this very complicated challenge.
Mike Memoli live for us there after a very long and busy day at the White House. Mem, thank you for being with us. Matt Bodner is at the other side of the world now. He's live for us in Moscow. Matt, it's good to see you. The Kremlin is giving their own version of this call, right? We're hearing the Russians' version of this call, and they're highlighting this push by Putin to try to keep Ukraine out of NATO, right? Talk about that, what you could call spin coming from your neck of the woods tonight.
Yeah, sure, Hallie. So it's actually funny. They waited 3 hours to release their own version of the readout that the White House put out within an hour of the call ending. And while, you know, it was pretty straightforward, it confirmed a lot of Biden's points, but it also had this very lengthy kind of explanation or response from basically the Kremlin to try to answer Biden's narrative, the White House's narrative, and it was all about NATO, Ukraine and NATO. You know, they acknowledged that more sanctions might be coming. You know, they were open about what they were threatened with. So I think we'll see a lot of that play out tomorrow once the state propagandists wake up. Morning headline read-in will be interesting tomorrow. But it just didn't seem like anyone kind of backed down from this, because we saw the exact same talking points from Vladimir Putin from the Kremlin that we'd been seeing in the lead up to this.
That's right.
That's where we're at now.
Let's talk about this idea of sanctions, right? Because this congressional report says there have been more than 700 Russians sanctioned because of Ukraine. There's analysts who say it's cost the country billions of dollars since 2014 and the invasion of Crimea. And yet here we are. And yet here Putin is. And yet here Russia is on the border of Ukraine yet again. Are sanctions that scary to them?
Yes and no. So, I mean, on the one hand, the sanctions that they've gotten were very personalized. There have been a few sectoral sanctions. They've managed to spin it narratively, so the Russian people are not necessarily afraid of them, though they are quite obsessed with them. What I'm getting at is that Russia has so far avoided being hit with the kind of, I've described it as like the shock and awe sanctions, the really big stuff. Things such as cutting Russia off from SWIFT, the international banking system. They have not actually seriously faced any of those types of consequences. And so you know, they really do laugh at everything else at the individual sanctions. It's almost as if Russian officials wear it as a badge of honor at this point. Some of the sectoral stuff has been spun to kind of look as it's positive for the Russian economy. And in some cases, sure, yeah, it gave them impetus to modernize certain sectors of the economy that were dependent on imports, but they haven't faced the big stuff yet, and I think that might be what's different this time.
Real quickly, Matt, let's say we were to see Putin de-escalate. Let's say he, you know, sleeps on it, really thinks about what President Biden has to say, and says, all right, let me pull my troops back off the border. He's going to wait a little bit, right, to take action one way or the other, it seems. It feels like time is on his side here. Am I reading that right?
I think you got to wait on this one. I mean, he's got two extremely clear examples now that if you just pile enough tanks and troops on the Ukrainian border, Biden will pick up the phone. So there doesn't seem to be great incentive to immediately pull them back, especially when he really wants to follow up on this question about NATO and Ukraine and all the other stuff that came up here. Those tanks stay there. The dialogue continues.
Matt Bodner, up late or early for us in Moscow. Matt, thank you very much. It's good to see you. Appreciate it. So things apparently got a little testy today in court when Jussie Smollett argued with prosecutors over details of what happened leading up to and on the night that he was allegedly attacked, with closing arguments set for tomorrow after the defense rested. Then it's going to be up to a jury, right, to decide whether Smollett lied to police and staged that attack in 2019. Remember that? Worldwide headlines for this one. And the actor said 2 men wearing ski masks attacked him, poured bleach on him, shouted racist and homophobic slurs. There's even video of him talking with Chicago police with a noose around his neck. But his story seemed to unravel after police tracked down a couple of brothers who already knew Smollett and told police it was all part of a hoax. Smollett denies that. He says it's not a hoax. He denied it on the stand. And that's where some of those apparently heated moments happened. I want to bring in Danny Savalos about how this case played out in court. So, Danny, our team on the ground says, yeah, this was a heated exchange, right? Multiple of them between the actor, between prosecutors. Is that the best look if you're on the stand in your own defense in front of a jury when the trial's wrapping up?
No, and what you didn't see is the hours and hours of his defense attorneys. They must have sat him down and said, do not, under any circumstances, argue with the prosecutor. The rules of evidence are skewed against the witness. You can't win an argument with the prosecutor, not because he's better or smarter or anything, but because the rules are skewed against you. You will never win if you fight with the prosecutor on the stand. You may even think you dunked on him, but trust me, you didn't.
Does this come down to ultimately who is the most convincing, right? Because today on the stand, Smollett seemed to have an answer for a lot of stuff. Why he's on surveillance video with these brothers who, allegedly helped plan this hoax. Why he was texting them the night of the attack. That he'd written the brothers a check, not for staging attack, but for personal training. Is this a he said, they said thing, and the jury just decides who they trust more?
And this is kind of the risk of putting your client up there, because often the client thinks he has an answer for everything. Yeah. We've all met people like that in life that have an answer or an explanation for absolutely everything. And they may get off that stand thinking, I nailed that one, when in reality, the jury may have just found that not credible, that there's an answer, a seemingly completely innocent answer for every single incriminating event. It's far better to acknowledge that maybe you're not perfect, but you didn't do this thing they're saying.
So closing arguments, we know, are set to happen tomorrow. Then this thing goes to the jury, right? Smollett is facing 6 counts. And listen, this is about whether he filed these false police reports, right? I mean, in this very high-profile case, he's facing 6 counts of felony disorderly conduct for that. He could get up to 3 years in prison. Do you think that's realistic, right, if he is found guilty here?
If he's found guilty on everything, it's almost never the case that somebody gets the statutory maximum, because you get that number by taking the maximum and lining them up end to end. And unless somebody has a significant criminal history, they're normally going to get something less than the statutory maximum. If you have no criminal history at all, you might have a good shot at a probation-only sentence. But it is proper to report the possible maximum because it is possible. It's just not likely, especially in a jurisdiction like this. He's likely to get closer on the probation side than a 3-year sentence.
Danny Savalos, thank you very much, my friend. Good to see you. In other trial news tonight, damning testimony in court from a third accuser. Accuser number 3, who says Ghislaine Maxwell recruited her and other young girls for Jeffrey Epstein to abuse. A woman who's being identified as Carolyn says she met Maxwell and Epstein when she was just 14 years old in Florida. She testified she went to Epstein's house more than 100 times, that each time there was some kind of sex act involved. And the person who set up these appointments, according to Carolyn, Maxwell. She also testified that when she turned 18, Epstein asked if she had any younger friends because she was too old now. Tom Winter has been following this trial for us. I have to say, Tom, these are really disturbing details that this woman, Carolyn, has attested to today in court under oath, making clear that Maxwell knew she was only 14 when she was recruited, basically, for sex with Epstein. This is in line with what we've seen from other accusers. How did that resonate in the room?
You know, Hallie, it appears that it definitely had some sort of resonation in the room. And I can tell you just 5 minutes ago, court got out for the day, and it concluded with very emotional testimony by Carolyn. This is just her first name that she's using. She was asked by federal prosecutor Maureen Comey whether she's doing this for the money. She was in near tears, sobbing as she was giving her answer, saying no amount of money could ever help her for what she went through here today. Very clear as far as the types of things that have happened. You know, Hallie, federal prosecutors, in order to prove their case, have to kind of go down the list and tick off certain boxes that meet the charges that they've brought here. In this particular case, it centers on a couple of things. Did Ghislaine Maxwell try to get these individuals to travel, or did they in fact travel for the purposes of sex with Jeffrey Epstein? Was there some sort of a nexus to New York, because this is being charged by federal prosecutors here in New York City? And also some other elements that have to do with the sex trafficking. And if you're federal prosecutors today, you establish that Ghislaine Maxwell was picking up the phone while in New York City, talking to this victim, Carolyn, and saying, hey, are you available? We're on our way down for these massages. Hey, we'd like you to travel to the private island. And she says, look, my mom's never going to let me go. I'm too young. And she said that she was 14 years old at the time. So those are some of the little details I mentioned to you, Hallie, as an example of some of the things that prosecutors need to try to bring forward here in order to prove their case. It appears they got some of those elements in today, if the jury believes the witness.
So I think we're supposed to hear from one more accuser, right? So likely another day of some frankly, likely gut-wrenching testimony here. And then the defense gets their chance to try to defend Ghislaine Maxwell here. Talk through their strategy after, the jury now has heard days of the sort of details that you're describing here.
Right. Yeah, I think their strategy is a couple different components, and I don't think it's just one accuser that we have left. I think there could be another witness or two or another wrinkle up the sleeve of the prosecution. They've had success here so far, Hallie, having other people come in and introduce.
My spidey senses are going off, Tom. What do you know that I don't know? Tell me.
Well, I think, to speak generally, Hallie, and to make sure I'm not getting ahead of the case, I think that there are other individuals who may have seen these women at various times around Epstein's properties or his plane that may be able to testify as to what they saw and to help corroborate some of these accounts. And I think right now that's the best that I can share with you. But as far as to get to your question of the defense, at every opportunity they have said, and they have gone after the credibility of these victims, specifically their memories and their motivation for testifying and coming forward in helping these charges come forward. I think you're going to see more testimony along those lines. Could some of these alleged victims have friends that may have contradictory testimony? That's a possibility too. But the defense hasn't shared their witness list, neither has the prosecution for that matter. So we're not really getting a good advanced preview of what we can expect from them, Hallie.
Well, I know you'll be there on the ground covering all of it. Tom Winter, live for us there in New York. Tom, thank you so much. So back here in D.C., the Biden administration wants to put in place this mandate now for workers across the country to either get vaccinated or have weekly testing. But there's been a setback, right? This federal judge in Georgia is temporarily blocking this vaccine mandate for federal contractors nationwide. This is a piece of the mandate the Biden administration wants to put in place. This is after a whole bunch of state lawsuits challenge it. It was supposed to go into effect January 4th. The judge says the president probably overstepped his bounds here. Joining me now, the inimitable Pete Williams. Pete, talk to us about this, because the judge says the president overstepped his bounds, basically went too far in this, in requiring federal contractors to get vaccinated. But the White House has had a defense to this. I mean, this is not a new question. They've been saying, hey, we're within our rights to do this.
Well, the judge disagrees. The judge says that, the government acted here under the president's broad authority to set the standards for federal contracts. But what the judge says is that's all about uniform accounting principles and management. This is a public health measure. That law doesn't get you there. So for that reason, he has imposed a nationwide injunction on this restriction that will apply to federal contractors. So that's that for this one. And by the way, the government is now 0 for 3 on these. Remember, there was the OSHA restriction for large businesses with over 100 employees. That's been stopped by a federal court. There's a multi-district litigation thing that's got court documents that'll have to be filed here in the coming weeks and months. Then we just had last week a federal judge stop the government's mandate for healthcare workers. So those were the 3 restrictions that the Biden administration tried to put in place by itself, and they've all been shut down by the courts.
You say temporary injunction in this one instance, right? What does that mean? What does that look like? Obviously, I assume there will be appeals here, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. But what it means is that until a judge rules that, yes, the government did have this authority, these injunctions will remain in place. The government cannot enforce these vaccine mandates.
Is it possible this goes all the way up to the Supreme Court?
I suppose, yes. I mean, whoever loses could certainly ask the Supreme Court. But if the government has lost at every stage, in the trial court and then in the Court of Appeals, Would the Supreme Court take the case? Maybe not.
So what's the next step then, logically, if you're, the Biden administration who wants to get these over the finish line?
Well, in each case, in each of these three cases, in the case of the healthcare workers, the employers, and the federal contractors, the government will be duking it out with the people who oppose these in the various federal courts. The big multi-district litigation in the Sixth Circuit for the OSHA requirements, and these separate lawsuits for the healthcare workers and the federal contractors. And there'll be trials. Assuming the government wants to continue to fight them, which I assume they will.
Are any one of these three cases, are you watching any one of them, these three pieces as you've described them, more closely than the others? Like, does one have a little more weight or significance?
Well, I think the OSHA one, because presumably that would apply to more people. And that's the one that's sort of furthest along in the appeals. There's a strange aspect about that case that said if you want to challenge it, you go directly to a federal appeals court. You bypass the district court. That's not been true with these others. It's just a weird little wrinkle in that particular one. So that one's sort of further along in the pipeline.
To be super clear, this is also, and correct me if I'm wrong, separate from the other sort of mandate, as it's being called, that's getting a lot of attention, which is the ask from the Biden administration that employers, the nation's businesses, big employers, require employees to either get vaccinated or go through weekly testing. And as you know, the Congress is set to take up.
That is the OSHA case. That is the one that's in the Sixth Circuit.
Got it.
That's the one that's also on hold. So you had three, all of them shut down right now. And, we say temporary because that's the way injunctions work until a federal court kind of ultimately rules. These are sort of preliminary stages. So what you do when you want an injunction, you go in and say, when you get around to hearing this case and deciding it on the merits, we are likely to win. And because of that, you should shut it down now. Right. That's what all these courts have said. Yes, you're likely to win in each of these cases, but that hasn't been decided for certain and for all time. But for now, it's all on hold.
No reaction yet from the Biden administration?
No, haven't heard. I'm sure they'll say that they'll appeal.
Okay. Well, we'll have you back tomorrow to talk more about it if they do.
Always available.
That's a threat, not a promise. Thank you, Pete Williams. Appreciate it. The U.S. Surgeon General has a warning for a whole bunch of us, right? We know the pandemic has been really hard on everybody, but it's been especially hard on kids, on teenagers. And it's pretty rare for a Surgeon General to sound the alarm in an advisory like what he's doing now, laying out these details in this big report, 53 pages, talking about how symptoms of depression and anxiety in kids have doubled during the pandemic. 1 in 4 kids, right? 25%. So if you know 4 kids, one of them is probably experiencing depressive symptoms. 1 in 5 have anxiety. And we know that it's not like this pandemic is going to be wrapped up tomorrow, right? You've got more variants. You got Delta still an issue. You got Omicron popping up. Cases are more than 100,000 a day. Our Kristen Dahlgren is here to talk about all of this. And Kristen, this report says that before the pandemic, right, mental health challenges were the leading reason why there were poor life outcomes. That's kind of a medical term in young people, right? But why life got harder for young people. Now, the Surgeon General is saying the pandemic is making it worse for all kids, but some kids are feeling it more than others.
Right. And this is when we're talking about economic and social barriers. So the report, is very clear, pointing out that immigrants, low-income families, kids in those situations feeling it a little bit more than others. But those stats, Hallie, really stark when you talk about it. And this one really got me. ER visits for suicide attempts for adolescent girls up 51% from the beginning of 2019 to that same period in 2021. It's really just alarming and a really big deal that the Surgeon General today is making this a health advisory.
And it's such a horrific statistic, Kristen. And you talk about what the Surgeon General is saying, that this is an emerging crisis, right? I know you had a chance to talk with him one-on-one today. What's the plan, right? What are the solution steps here, whether you're a parent or just, an adult who cares about the kids in your life?
Right. And so it's laid out very clearly. This is a 53-page report, basically, that lays it out on all of those fronts. And look, when I talked to him, he pointed out he's a dad, too. He has young kids. And so he said this is for his kids and their mental health as well as anyone. So he has a few things that he wants to tackle. So access to high-quality mental health care for everyone, addressing those economic and social barriers, expanding support of early childhood and education workforce. And then I asked him, so for those of us who are parents out there, what do we need to know? And here's what he told me.
Number one, start a conversation about mental health with your children. You'd be surprised at just starting the conversation, how they can really open things up with your kids and let them know that it's okay to talk to you about these issues. The second thing is to make sure that we encourage our children to ask for help.
Right. And he said kids need to know that this isn't their fault. They're not alone in this. And it's okay to talk about it. It's so much about destigmatizing mental health. It's as important as our physical health. And so it's something that he wants everybody on all fronts to know it's okay to talk about this. And talking is one of the most important things that we can do, Hallie.
Kristen, you are preaching to the choir here on that one. You know, that's something we talk about a lot on this show, right? Is like open up the doors, talk about it when it comes to the stigma. But that requires like everybody to kind of get on board with that, right? And that's still, it feels like, you know, I think in some ways and in some circles, a step that some folks are just not ready to take.
Right. And it can be tough at that age. Look, you want to fit in, you know, social media was a big part of it as well. And, you know, I talked to one girl today and she was talking about how Instagram for her was what she was talking about, makes her feel terrible about herself. And all her friends have this awful body image because of the images that they're seeing. Instagram came out with a few steps today that it's taking. That was a part of the Surgeon General's report as well, really wanting the companies to create these platforms that are positive for kids rather than having this negative impact on their mental health. And by the way, timely, Kristen, as we're talking more about that later in the show. Kristen Dahlgren, it's great to see you. Thank you for that important reporting and for sharing that story with us. Appreciate it. You bet. We should note that if you or anybody that you know is struggling, thinking of harming yourself, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. People are here for you. People want to help you. The number is here, 800-273-8255. Coming up here on the show, an update in the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi of The Washington Post, an arrest made in connection to the killing that created outrage all around the world. Matt Bradley has more details for us on the other side of the break. Somebody suspected of being part of the hit squad that killed Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi has been arrested now in Paris. You might remember Khashoggi was the journalist who went into the Saudi consulate back in 2018 and never came out. Investigators think he was murdered and dismembered there. He was a critic of the Saudi crown prince, who U.S. intelligence found was likely the person that approved his murder. Saudi Arabia says he was killed by accident. Matt Bradley joins us now. Okay, so Matt, there's a lot of people, or at least several of them, that have already been tried for the murder of Khashoggi, right? Talk about how this latest suspect fits into what we know about this plot.
Well, look, these people who have been tried, those are people who were put up by the Saudi government, tried by the Saudi government. Almost no one was allowed in the courtroom at the time. So these people who are being arrested now, and this is the first one who's been arrested outside of Saudi Arabia. This man is part of a list of 26 who the Turkish government have said the Turkish government has accused of being responsible for the murder. It was the Turkish government who put them on the red list for Interpol. And that's how this man, Khalid Ayed El-Otaibi, he's 33 years old. That's how he got arrested in Paris. So he is probably going to have his choice. Either he can contest what looks like it's going to be an extradition to Turkey, since it was Turkey who wants him, or he can just get on a plane and go to Istanbul, go to Turkey, and face trial. But regardless, he's just the first on a long list of more than 24 people who the Turkish government have accused of this, so we could expect more.
Khashoggi's fiance, I know you remember, was outside the consulate in Turkey that day, and she's talking now, right? She has something to say about the arrest today?
She's been outspoken the entire time, unlike other members of Khashoggi's family who have basically forgiven the Saudi royal family. She tweeted today, Hadis Cengiz, I welcome the arrest of one of Jamal's killers today in France. France should try him for his crime or extradite him to a country able and willing to genuinely investigate and prosecute him, as well as the person who gave the order to murder Jamal. That person is MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. That's who we know she's talking about. That's who U.S. intelligence agencies have said is responsible for the murder. He's the one who basically sent in that hit squad and said to kill Jamal Khashoggi back in 2018.
Matt Bradley, it's important reporting. Thank you for bringing it to us. I appreciate it. Coming up here on the show, Travis Scott responding for the first time to all those lawsuits he's named in after that deadly Astroworld concerts. That, I should say, singular. It was one concert, multiple deaths, of course. We're going to tell you what he wants now, as he says he's not to blame for any deaths. Plus, will he or won't he? Looks like former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows is not going to cooperate with the January 6th investigation after he said he would. What threat he faces now, coming up. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, Chile has passed a law letting same-sex couples marry. The vote comes after a battle that's lasted nearly a decade. When the president signs the bill, Chile will join 30 other countries where same-sex marriage is legal. Number 2, at least 34 people have been killed after the eruption of the highest volcano in Indonesia. You see it here, rescuers going through. They're digging through these thick layers of hot ash, through debris. They're looking for survivors. Thousands of people have lost their homes. Number 3, Facebook is facing a $150 billion lawsuit from members of the Rohingya refugee group in Myanmar. The class action suit claims Facebook failed to stop posts that incited violence against them. The suit was filed in California, and lawyers in the UK say they plan to file one there, too. Number 4, in his first legal response to the Astroworld concert and the deaths and the injuries that happened there, Travis Scott is asking a judge to dismiss 11 suits against him. Scott's denying any legal responsibility for the 10 deaths at his show last month. He's named in nearly 300 suits that have been filed accusing him of negligence. And number 5, billionaire Michael Steinhardt is returning $70 million worth of stolen ancient art. Many of the artifacts looted from their countries of origin during wartime, according to New York prosecutors. Steinhardt won't have to do any jail time, but he is banned from buying antiques for the rest of his life. Taking over to Capitol Hill now with some news developing here in Washington. Some people talking, some people very much not talking to Congress now, and some new testimony from the Inspector General for the Capitol Police. Michael Bolton telling the Senate committee today that more work still needs to be done to improve training and intelligence. But he thinks officers' morale is getting better, at least for now, because of some steps he's taken. And then there's this tale of two Marks, right? Mark Short, chief of staff to former Vice President Mike Pence. NBC learning he's cooperating with the January 6th Select Committee so far after a subpoena. But Mark Meadows, the chief of staff to former President Trump, he's no longer down to cooperate. And now today, the Select Committee not happy about that. They say they're going to move forward with potentially holding him in contempt of Congress if he doesn't show for a deposition tomorrow. Then there's Steve Bannon, who never complied with his subpoena. He was indicted for contempt of Congress. His trial, we just learned today, is now set for July. So looking ahead to that next summer. Joining us to break this down, Leanne Caldwell, live on the Hill. So, Leanne, let me start with this. Listen, we are getting closer to the one-year anniversary, the commemoration of what happened on January 6th, that horrific riot at the Capitol. The Inspector General is now saying, yeah, there is still a lot of work to be done inside Capitol Police almost a year after that insurrection, right? Talk to us about how they've improved and the distance they still need to go here.
Yeah, Hallie, there's a couple things that stood out to me from that hearing today. First, the Inspector General talked about how they're trying to transform the Capitol Police from a police force to a protective agency. Think something like Secret Service to protect these members of Congress around the clock. In addition, he still highlighted the retention problem of Capitol Police. They keep losing people, and they are not hiring enough people to make up for that. And the Capitol Police who are still working, they're working hundreds of hours of overtime, which is also a problem. So while he said morale is getting better, there's still a big problem here just with staffing, and they want to beef up tremendously, and it's really difficult when you don't have the people to do it, Hallie.
Talked about this potential contempt of Congress charge that could come against former Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows very soon, Leanne. I mean, this is somebody, just to make sure folks remember, he's like the right-hand guy of former President Trump when they were in office, right, when he was in the White House. With him, the days leading up to and around January 6th, right? He's citing these executive privilege claims that the former president is making, which is why he says he's not down to cooperate. He does not want to show up for this deposition tomorrow. But this is serious stuff. We saw Steve Bannon not just get that contempt of Congress charge, he's getting indicted for it, right? So talk me through what Meadows' next steps are here.
Yeah, so Meadows wasn't cooperating, and then he was cooperating within these guidelines that don't violate what he says executive privilege. And now, again, he says he's not cooperating. He says that the committee tried to cross that line of executive privilege, and that was a step too far for him. He gave an interview earlier today on far-right radio and podcast saying that they subpoenaed a third party, and that was too much for him to receive some of the information about him. And so now we could see the committee take the exact same steps they took with Steve Bannon, which I am very skeptical that Mark Meadows is still going to resist cooperating. We know that Mark Meadows, he likes to please everyone, and he does not want to go to jail. So I think the story isn't over yet, but the committee is threatening to do the same thing they did with Steve Bannon, Hallie.
And real quick, Leanne, you know, there's potential, right, that Mark Meadows may just try to run out the clock here. We know that this Steve Bannon trial is going to happen not until next summer, right, or this summer, however we're going to phrase it, July. The January 6th Select Committee wants to get a whole lot of work done and wants a whole lot more information well before that, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. July is 8 months away. The Select Committee could, if the Republicans win control of the House next year, the Select Committee could disappear as early as the next year. And Steve Bannon and his process, it does not compel him to testify. That is an important point. It does not compel him to provide any information to the Select Committee. And so Mark Meadows, if he goes through the same path, that means that he perhaps will not have to cooperate with the committee if he goes through the Department of Justice. But I will say, Zoe Lofgren, a member of that committee, was on MSNBC earlier today, and she said that they've already received documents from Mark Meadows and some important documents as well. So that's already part of the record, Hallie.
Leanne Caldwell, live for us on the Hill. Interesting stuff. Leanne, thank you.
Yep.
China says the U.S. is going to pay a price for putting in place this diplomatic boycott on the Beijing Olympics. This is what we're hearing from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, where a spokesperson is accusing the U.S. of going against political neutrality in sports, saying the decision not to send diplomats to the game is, quote, based on lies and rumors. The, quote, unquote, lies and rumors he's referring to, by the way, is the mass repression of the Uyghur minority group in Xinjiang. The U.S. has called it genocide. Not a lie, not a rumor. China denies it. Just to remind you, the Olympic Winter Games are not going to look any different, right, because athletes from the U.S. are still going to compete. It's just that big-time government officials, the vice president, the first lady, et cetera, they're not going to go. They're not going to be there for the opening or closing ceremonies, as you know they usually are. So now that the U.S. has put the diplomatic foot down, if you will, everybody's looking to other countries to see whether they're going to follow suit and maybe sit this one out diplomatically, too. Sam Brock is here with more. Sam, let's talk about China's response this morning, right? They're saying the U.S. will pay a price for this decision. Doesn't seem like they're going to address in any substantive way the reasons why the U.S. decided to diplomatically boycott. What is it telling you, right? What does that say to you about where the relationship on this front is headed?
I think it's pretty clear in just the plainest English, Hallie, that this is a huge dig at China, and that China perceives it as a huge dig because there's a sense of political neutrality that is associated with the Olympics that many countries adhere to. And even though historically there have been boycotts, it's such an important fundamental credo of the Olympics. Now, that said, where does this take us? Does it mean that China is going to be boycotting the Olympics in Los Angeles in 2028? It might be a little hard to forecast at this point, but we also know that President Xi and President Biden had a virtual talk just weeks ago. One of the things that was on the table there was national security and nuclear armaments. And China right now at this point in time is stockpiling their nuclear arms. There's a concern, of course, they've demonstrated hypersonic capabilities. They were going to start a dialogue on that. Does that still happen? There's the economic repercussions as well. China, Mexico, and Canada are the biggest trade partners for the United States, and China's zero-tolerance policy with respect to COVID has helped to clog up those supply chain issues that we've seen across the world. Then, of course, it becomes, there were rumblings. Will they be easing some of those restrictions, especially as it pertains to getting American businesses in and out of China? Well, that might not happen as well. There are so many possible ramifications for this. Yeah. But you're going to pay a price is an awfully vague statement for China to make.
Sam, first of all, on the show, we love the plainest of plain English. So thank you, because you're right? It's a dig at China. China sees it that way. And then other countries, right, are they going to take these digs too? New Zealand said, yeah, we're not going to send our diplomats. Italy said, we are going to send our diplomats. They're not going to be joining this diplomatic boycott. And then you have all these other countries where we're like, okay, what are you going to do? Nothing final yet, right? Any insight into how some of that decision-making happens?
Who's going to take the first step? Exactly. I think it really is on a country-by-country basis. With respect to Italy, for example, they're hosting the 2026 Winter Games. They have to send emissaries to accept the baton. That might have gone into Italy's rationale right now. As far as New Zealand is concerned, they planted their flag in the sand back in October, partly potentially because of COVID, partly because of human rights abuses. You have the rest of the European Union right now just hanging in the balance, Hallie. What is Britain and Germany and France? What are they going to do? We do know this. The European Union has instituted travel restrictions on anyone in China associated with the crackdown of the Uyghurs in Western China. They've already taken action, and the European Parliament has also passed a non-binding resolution saying that they would diplomatically boycott these games unless there is improvement shown on the crackdown of free speech in Hong Kong, certainly on the suppression of human beings in the western part of the country. Remains to be seen if any of those things have actually come to fruition.
What's so interesting, Sam, is like you and I can sit here and have this conversation on NBC News now. If you're in China, right, if you're looking on social, you cannot actually search for U.S. diplomatic boycott, right? Like if you put those words into social media, it's censored as of this morning. And you have to think that's going to have some kind of an impact, right? We know China does this all the time. They did it with Peng Shuai, the Chinese tennis star as well, et cetera, et cetera. That has an impact on the conversation around this topic.
All I can say, Hallie, it is so emblematic of why there is a boycott in the first place in China. You can't search for information or know what's actually going on around you. There is, of course, the suppression of the ability to freely assemble and protest, the lack of democratic values that are in place. That's why the U.S. is taking the stand in the first place.
Sam Brock, thank you so much. Love having you on. Appreciate your reporting there. Thanks. Coming up on the show, there's a lot of stuff out there just floating in the sea. What about $1 million worth of cocaine? Well, that's what one Good Samaritan found before handing it right over to the police. That's next in The Local. Plus, making it rain. Literally, we're talking about changing the weather. Cal Perry's going to tell us how in The Original. If you could control the weather, would you? Maybe a little less rain, a little more sun, blue skies. Well, there's something called cloud seeding that is actually helping to modify weather as we know it. Cal Perry knows all about this. He's going to come up for us in a second in tonight's Original. But first, NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day. And because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our LA bureau, a driver is under arrest after a high-speed car chase. Here's the video. The LAPD had to chase whoever was in that green car all through the streets of LA. Eventually, yikes, crashed. Tried to make a run for it. Nobody's quick enough to evade the LAPD choppers, people. Nobody's quick enough. Guy got busted. From a Northeast bureau. Maybe you've forgotten a water bottle or something in your bag while going through TSA at the airport. Who among us, right? Have you ever forgotten a sword? That seems to have slipped the mind of one guy at LaGuardia in New York City. Swords, I have to tell you, swords are not allowed in your carry-on. I needed to let you know that. We don't know if this person faces charges or was arrested, but certainly a story for the agent who found it. And our Southeast Bureau reporting a Good Samaritan returning a package in Florida, a package of more than $1 million worth of cocaine. Officials say it weighed something like 69 pounds. It was found just floating in the water near the Keys. I want to bring you now tonight's Original with in-depth reporting on a topic we've been keeping an eye on. And tonight, we're looking at something called cloud seeding, right? It's this method designed by scientists to help a cloud be able to create more rain or more snow. Why does this matter? Because if you live out west, you need rain and snow right now. There's this drought. You want more precipitation. But making it rain comes with controversy, right? Some states say it's not worth it because of the effect it has on the environment. Here's Cal Perry with more.
The mile-high city is bone dry.
It's kind of scary, I'm not going to lie.
Breaking records, it hasn't snowed at all this winter. Put another way, it hasn't snowed in at least 230 days.
We've always had water issues out west.
It's a little unsettling.
It's not just Denver. The otherwise picturesque Rocky Mountain resort towns are mostly bare. Vail, crown jewel of Colorado ski country, only 7% of its terrain is currently accessible. That's 25 of 317 trails. Only 6 of 33 lifts are open.
Come here to the Dillon Reservoir, where Denver gets its water, and it becomes clear this is not just a weather story. This is not just a ski story. This is a climate story. A climate story about the West, which is in the middle of a water crisis.
For the first time ever, earlier this year, the federal government declared a water shortage on the Colorado River. All of this brings Mike Eitel to the top of the Rockies. He's a senior water resource specialist with the Colorado River Water Conservation District. They call it cloud seeding, or weather modification, blasting silver iodide into the sky to improve a cloud's ability to make it rain or snow. They say as much as 2 to 12% more per storm.
This is moisture in the cloud that would not fall out normally. So I use the analogy of squeezing a sponge. You just get a little bit more out of every storm. Every drop counts. It matters.
Not just on the ground, these programs extend to aircraft. And here, it's partially paid for by downriver states that desperately need the water.
State funding comes from the lower basin states like California, Arizona, Nevada. They also supply the state a significant amount of funds, and that's dispersed throughout all the programs, not just this one.
How important do you think this will be going forward?
I think this is just another tool in the toolbox for us here in the water supply effort. It's measured in years and decades rather than individual storms, if you ask me. It's a long-term project. The drought does not, maybe makes it more of a concern, but we're still doing it in wet years. We're doing it in dry years.
Cal Perry joins us now. Cal, it's incredible to see you out there in Colorado telling the story, sharing it with us. I heard that statistic that you mentioned and that the person you interviewed mentioned, the idea that it's maybe 2 to 12% per storm, right? And every drop counts. I get that, but help me put that in perspective, because 2% more per storm doesn't seem like a whole lot, you know?
No, but it is 2% to 12%. If you take last year, this program in central Colorado, it would fill that Dillon Reservoir that you saw me walking through about halfway. That would make a huge difference for Denver. And as we travel around the country, Hallie, and you know this, you've been out here, you've seen it, it's scary.
Yeah.
Lake Mead is at its lowest level ever. Lake Dillon is at its lowest level ever, though they are sort of allowing more water in there to keep it from going out. But it's frightening, and it's sort of really ominous for these western cities. I mean, driving through Vail, and you can see behind me, there's really no snow this year. It's really sort of tragic.
Like, and it's tragic beyond, Cal, what you talked about, beyond just for like skiers, right? For the recreational tourism thing for it. There's real impact here. And what's interesting, though, is like not every state is on board with this, right? New Mexico, for example, has pushed back because of this silver iodide that these researchers are like, you know, spraying into the sky, basically, right? There's some controversy around this and some pushback to this technology, too.
And I think you're going to need to have renewed education on this front, because we live now in a new climate reality. These programs are taking place across the world. They've been taking place since World War II. The studies on this, the environmental studies, show that the levels are well below what the government considers dangerous. But as you're saying, you do have some communities. We have this community in New Mexico that voiced some concern. So I think there needs to be more education on this. There certainly needs to be more reporting on this as we face these sort of very serious water issues, Hallie.
More research, it seems, too, can't hurt. I know that some of that is really well established, but even now, even in you know, what we're seeing in Congress, they're trying to put more money towards studying this.
Right, and you have the Build Back Better infrastructure plan, $8 billion set aside for Western water issues. Some of that is for the snowpack. One of the most interesting things about this story is who's paying for these programs. If you look at Idaho, it's the power company in Idaho, because they don't want those water levels to drop below where they can make hydroelectric power. The other thing about this story is this is clean energy, right, Hallie? This is not something we want to lose. We don't want to lose the very little clean energy that we currently have. Hydroelectric power is key in that. So you have power companies, you have private companies. The private companies here, some of these ski resorts, for years were paying for it. They've hit a financial crunch. Part of that's been the pandemic. They're tailing back. But who is paying for this is its own story, Hallie.
I hope you tell it. Cal, we'll have you back from Colorado, my friend. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate your time. Instagram announcing some new safety updates specifically aimed at teens right before the company's supposed to get questioned on Capitol Hill. So is this going to actually help? We'll talk about it next. Instagram's CEO is showing up in front of Congress tomorrow to answer what you know is going to be some tough questioning about whether Insta is contributing in a big way to depression among young girls. According to leaked internal documents by a whistleblower, 32% of teen girls said that when they felt bad about their bodies, Instagram made them feel worse. We should note the company has really pushed back against the context and characterization of that. Today, however, Instagram, again, the day before the CEO testifies, is announcing some new safety features. One lets users set reminders to get off the app. Teens cannot be tagged by people that they don't follow. And mom and dad have entered the chat. Starting next year, they're going to be able to see and limit how much time their teen spends on Insta. Callan Rosenblatt is here now with more. Callan, when we look at how Meta, right, which is the parent company of Instagram, used to be called Facebook, operates, the timing here is interesting. Not necessarily nefarious, right? You've got the CEO of Instagram testifying in front of Congress tomorrow. That is going to be some very closely watched testimony. It seems like Instagram maybe wanted to get ahead of that, to be able to have Adam Mosseri be able to say, look at all the things we're doing. Here's all the initiatives we're taking. And to basically have some like good news to serve up to lawmakers on a silver platter.
Absolutely. I mean, Hallie, I don't have any insider information on this one in particular, but it makes sense why they'd be releasing these features ahead of this appearance on Capitol Hill. I mean, if you've been paying attention, all these heads of different social media apps have been getting torn apart every time they come to Capitol Hill, whether it's Facebook, TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram. It's been sort of a bloodbath, a bipartisan bloodbath at that. And I could see why, it's kind of the writing is on the wall as to why Instagram would be releasing these features that Capitol Hill seems to be asking for right before this appearance.
One of the updates, let's talk about it. It's called Take a Break. It tells you to stop scrolling when you've been on too long, but it's not like this is groundbreaking, right? TikTok's been doing this. Is it your sense, like, why did Instagram wait so long, I think, to put this into place?
You know, I don't have any insider information on this one, but I do think that, you know, people have talked about TikTok and this feature for a long time. Now, I got to say, on TikTok, just like on Instagram with this new feature, you can just scroll right past it. Like, you can just go right back to it. But the reminders do help to be like, oh, yeah, I have kind of been on here for a while. Maybe I should get up, stretch my legs, like go do something else. Or, oh, yeah, I didn't realize I've been looking at, you know, body positivity posts for, you know, X amount of time, and now I'm kind of feeling weird about myself. I think it is a helpful tool, but you know, I think Instagram picked this up, and from the buzz that's been around TikTok, and because TikTok has had a lot of positive responses, although there's been critiques of TikTok, critiques of Instagram, this is at least a step in the right direction to getting young people out of those rabbit holes that they fall down.
Really quick, Callan, parents and their safety groups for parents, now that they're getting some access to see how long their kids have been on the app, et cetera, are they considering that kind of a win for them?
It's like a yes and no question. Like, yes, it's great that now you can pinpoint how long your child is spending on Instagram. But if you don't know exactly what they're looking at, I mean, they could be looking at cats for 6 hours, you know? If you don't know what the content is, then you don't know how it's affecting them. So I think there's a lot more that Instagram needs to do here in order to make parents feel safe. But at least we're starting to move a tiny bit in the right direction.
Callan Rosenblatt, thank you so much. Good to see you. Thanks to all of you for joining us here on the show. More Hallie Jackson now tomorrow, same time, same place.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.